All right, today's stand up, we're going to talk about zero trust and XDR. Zero trust has been gaining a lot of speed in the last few years. In particular, started to hear about it, at least I did, on the fringes of cybersecurity. I started hearing about it in the last 2 years or so, and it's really become an important part of strategy and how you plan for your overall security. And it's the second of five practices that Microsoft has called out in their latest digital defense report. So let's talk about that, Yuri. Zero trust. To me, coming from a background of like leadership and management training and that kind of thing, we always talk about trust everyone. And now you're telling me to trust no one. Like, help me understand that.
Yeah, or in Ronald Reagan terms, trust but verify. So this is a really good topic to bring up because zero trust has been, all over the news for years, and it really took off during COVID when you had a lot of remote workers logging into the company network, right? And so zero trust really challenges the traditional notion of trust within the perimeter, right? Because in the '90s, you would have a company that had a data center on their premises, and users would come into the office and they would be behind the castle walls, if you will, right? And so as technology evolved, we started seeing more cloud applications. We started seeing remote access, BYOD, and mobile devices. We had all these connections outside of the perimeter. And so instead of assuming trust based on location or network boundaries, what zero trust does is it really operates on the principle of never trust and always verify, right? So the opposite of trust but verify. And this has been a sticking point in many management discussions because management teams have often thought like, well, the security team already doesn't trust our users, right? And so they see this as the negative. So I actually like to call it zero implicit trust, right? Not just zero trust, but zero implicit trust. Not in users, but in digital systems themselves, right? So, thoughts there, Brian? You're gonna say something?
Yeah, I'm just thinking about it. Like, I really think this is where we could use a rebranding. Like, we need somebody from marketing to come in and rebrand Zero Trust for the business as a whole, because I think, like, as you said, a lot of employees already feel like the security team doesn't trust you. And a lot of employees feel like, they're being babysat or watched over, big brother, whatever you want to call it, because they're not trusted. And so I think about to come out and say, okay, we now have zero trust. We're not trusting anybody at any time for anything. It seems like we could use a little bit of marketing there to improve that messaging to the users, to help them understand in a better way that, like, hey, it's not that we don't trust you. Even if we don't, like, you don't ever want to tell somebody that, right? Even if you don't trust them, you don't want to be like, hey, we don't trust you, so we're putting in these extra controls. That's not the right messaging to get somebody on board with what it is you're trying to do.
Yeah, yeah. And it's totally acceptable to, instead of using terms like zero trust in your management conversations, you can say something like, hey, well, this is modern security, right? You don't have to use this specific terms. If you're having a technical conversation with your engineers or architects, sure, you can absolutely discuss that. So you can say modern security, and then also explain to your teams that, hey, again, we're going from a perimeter based model where you had this castle and moat approach to where now users are working from remote, from coffee shops, from hotel rooms. You've got basically applications and services outside of the perimeter. So you have to shift those controls to wherever they live. And oftentimes they no longer live within the castle walls, right? So we're going from a perimeter based security model to more of a perimeterless or a borderless model. And I've even heard some people say, identity is the new perimeter, right? So instead of having, this firewall or this perimeter around your network, you are now using an identity as the actual control mechanism for access control. A couple other things I wanted to really quickly mention when we are talking about zero trust, and in Microsoft's digital defense report, when they're saying apply zero trust principles, the big three that they're calling out is explicitly verify. So again, when a system or a user or a device is logging into a cloud app or is attempting to access some data, you want to make sure that those devices are in good standing, that they're healthy, and that they're managed, right? And that can mean a lot of things. When you're talking about them being healthy, maybe they have the firewall enabled, they're encrypted, they have endpoint detection and response. So again, explicitly verify. The next one is use least privilege, right? You only want to give your users the minimum amount of access needed to do their jobs and nothing else, right? And the reason you want to do that is because if that account or device or user gets compromised, you want to make sure that you can limit the blast radius. And we see this all the time where organization might have domain administrators, which are accounts that can do pretty much anything on an on-prem network. They're either browsing the internet or they get compromised, and then all bets are off because the entire Active Directory domain is compromised at that point. And then the last one I'll throw out is assume breach, right? And the reason this is important is because I've been in many conversations where the discussion will go something like this: hey, well, these servers or these applications are not published to the internet, so we're good. And what that fails to address is that in today's world, a simple phishing attack can basically get a bad actor inside of your network, right? A simple credential theft attack can get bad actors inside of your network. We saw this with the Colonial Pipeline attack, where bad actors were able to basically use stolen credentials, VPN into this oil company, and compromise their network. So you have to assume that your network is compromised and approach it from that perspective as you're building out your security architecture. I'll stop there for a sec. Brian, anything you'd like to add?
So help me understand that a little bit more when you talk about assuming a breach. Like, are you just saying we come in the morning and we're just assuming somebody's in our network, we got to do stuff? Or is it different than that?
It's really what it is. It's a mindset, right? So it's saying, hey, do we have the proper controls? Do we have the proper monitoring on our network today that we can quickly identify, detect, and remediate an attack, right? So it's not assuming that, hey, you're inside the castle walls and there's no threats here, right? Everything is clean. So I'll give you an example. We hear of this term called microsegmentation, right? So if you look at a submarine, for instance, a submarine will have many different compartments, right? And so that if a breach of one compartment does occur, it doesn't flood the entire submarine. And that's what architecting for this principle of assumption of breach really means, is that you are designing your network. Your mindset is one that, hey, I should not assume that things are totally fine within our castle walls. You need to design your system that if the breach occurs, even if you're not breached today, you need to architect around the fact that a breach can occur. And if it does, how do you limit the damage?
So it's about segmenting your network so that if somebody does come in, they don't have access to the whole thing. They've got access to a smaller subset of.
Yeah, absolutely. And that actually, the next topic kind of is, or the next tactic is using extended detection and response. This is what Microsoft calls out on point number 3: use extended detection and response, XDR, and anti-malware. So when we talk about assumption of breach, the reason why we want controls like XDR, right, is to quickly identify, detect, and stop attacks, right? So if you assume that everything's okay and you're not architecting for assumption of breach, you're thinking like, well, I don't really need good visibility or good logging or good controls on-prem, right? And so when you think of that concept, you want something like XDR, which is basically monitoring, and detecting attacks in real time, if you will. Does that make sense?
Yeah, yeah, it does. So I like the castle analogies, but just it's maybe this isn't a perfect analogy, but I think of like your guardsmen standing in the towers are not just looking outside, but they're also looking inside. And you've got your castle built in a way where there's protections so that if you see, hey, there's an assassin in the stables, that they can't get over to the armory as well.
Right.
And you're able to cordon off the stables and take care of that threat where it is. And the rest of the castle, I mean, it's kind of like a lockdown in a sense, where it's like, okay, lock down the stables. We know the threat's there. We can go clean it up, and everybody else can go about their business in the other areas. Is that?
Yeah, that's fair. And actually, the story of the Trojan horse, right? So if you get a Trojan horse inside of your castle, right, and you're assuming everything's okay, and we've got these thick castle walls, we've got protection on the outside. Well, the Trojan horse, story of the Trojan horse proved that, hey, you've got to really design and think about, how do we protect if a bad actor or an adversary gets inside the castle walls, right? And so that's what XDR helps with. Is it's really a platform to collect all these signals, all this telemetry from all of your resources, from on-prem devices, from IoT devices, from cloud, from firewalls, identities, etc. And it takes all those signals and all this telemetry and feeds it into a security operations center, so that if an attack happens internally or inside your castle walls, you can quickly respond and remediate it.
Good deal. So what's our focused action for today? What are we doing today around Zero Trust and XDR?
I think it's again, thinking through about, like, how are you securing your organization today? Are you still using legacy thinking, where it's like, hey, I've got a firewall, I've got basic antivirus, and I'm good? Or are you challenging that notion and thinking about, like, hey, our users are now working from all over, all over the state or all over the country or even all over the globe, and are you putting on a hat about, look, we might be compromised, so we need to architect our networks and think about internal attacks as well. Yeah, so that's kind of my 2 cents
Good
there.
deal. And when you're designing your different segments, make sure you don't design the Titanic. That's the other thing that came to mind, is we're talking about building in segments. So if one gets breached, you're okay still. So don't design the Titanic.
Well, and that's a good
And
point.
don't be overconfident.
Don't be overconfident, and make sure you are actually testing your disaster recovery plan, right? A DR plan is only as good as the last test, right?
Yeah.
Same with backup. So
I just think about in the movie, in the movie Titanic, when I forget the character's name, but the shipbuilder, he said, they're talking about, like, we think the ship is going to sink, and the shipbuilder says, this is the Titanic. This ship can't sink.
right.
And then the response to that was, she's made of iron. Assure me she can sink.
Yeah, right, exactly. So
Don't be overconfident.
Yeah, don't be overconfident. Test your response plans and make sure you have enough lifeboats, right?
Yeah, good deal. All right, well, that'll do it for today. Good talking. We will see you again tomorrow.
Thanks.